13-year-old Jake had always been a little too curious for his own good. Spending the summer at his Aunt Eleanor's sprawling, mysterious mansion was supposed to be boring, but the place was anything but dull. The creaky floorboards, hidden staircases, and unusual artifacts scattered around the house kept his imagination spinning. However, nothing intrigued him more than the enormous wardrobe in Aunt Eleanor's bedroom. It wasn't an ordinary wardrobe. Standing nearly 10 feet tall, its surface was carved with intricate patterns of swirling vines and tiny figures that seemed to shimmer when the light hit them just right. Aunt Eleanor, a tall, stern woman with piercing eyes, had only one rule. Stay out of my bedroom. And never touch the wardrobe. Naturally, Jake couldn't stop thinking about it. What could be inside that required so much secrecy? Treasures? Hidden passages? Or something magical? One stormy afternoon, while his parents were out running errands and Aunt Eleanor was in town for tea, Jake decided to investigate. He tiptoed into her room, heart pounding. The air felt heavier inside, as if the room itself was alive and watching him. The wardrobe loomed in the corner, its carvings glinting faintly. Up close, Jake noticed that the tiny figures on the wood weren't just decorative, they were people. Tiny people etched in incredible detail, caught in poses of fear and awe, their faces turned toward the swirling vines. Ignoring the growing unease in his stomach, Jake reached for the ornate brass handle and pulled. The doors swung open with an unnatural creak, revealing an empty interior lined with plush red velvet. A faint, golden mist seemed to swirl inside. Confused, Jake leaned closer, expecting to see a hidden compartment or a secret panel. Suddenly, the mist surged forward, wrapping around him like a living thing. Before he could scream, the world tilted. He fell forward into the wardrobe and landed on something soft, a grass. Jake sat up, blinking in confusion. He wasn't in the wardrobe anymore. He was in a vast, open field surrounded by towering trees. Only, they weren't trees. They were blades of grass, each one as thick as a tree trunk and stretching hundreds of feet into the sky. "Where am I?" he muttered, his voice sounding small in the enormous world. The ground trembled beneath him. A deafening boom echoed in the distance, followed by another, and another. Jake turned, his heart racing, to see an enormous figure striding toward him. It was a woman, no, a giantess, with flowing golden hair and piercing blue eyes. She wore a dress that shimmered like liquid sunlight, and her footsteps made the earth shake. Jake froze, realizing she was looking directly at him. "Well, well," the giantess said, her voice a low, thunderous purr. "Another one from the mortal world. You humans never learn, do you?" Jake tried to run, but the giantess reached down with alarming speed, her massive hand closing around him like a cage. "You're just a child," she said, lifting him to eye level. "Foolish, but harmless. I suppose I should return you before Eleanor finds out." You know my aunt?" Jake stammered, his voice squeaky from fear. The giantess smirked. "Oh, I know Eleanor quite well. She's the one who sent you here. Didn't she warn you about meddling with things you don't understand?" Jake's mind raced. Sent him here. No, Aunt Eleanor had warned him, but she hadn't explained why. The giantess sighed, her breath warm and fragrant. "Mortals like you are always curious. It's how Eleanor gets her servants." "Servants?" Jake's stomach sank. "Oh, yes," the giantess said, her tone almost pitying. "You see those carvings on the wardrobe? Each one of those was once a human, foolish enough to open the door. Eleanor keeps them as decorations, or worse." Jake's eyes widened in horror as he remembered the tiny, frightened faces etched into the wood. "Please," he begged, "you have to help me get back." The giantess tilted her head, considering him. "I could send you back, but there's a price. Nothing in Eleanor's world is free." "What do you want?" Jake asked desperately. The giantess smiled, revealing gleaming white teeth. "You must promise to destroy the wardrobe when you return. It's the only way to break the cycle and free the others." Jake hesitated. Destroying the wardrobe sounded dangerous. Aunt Eleanor wouldn't let him get away with it. But if he didn't, he might end up as one of those tiny, frozen figures on its doors. "I promise," he said finally. The giantess nodded and muttered a strange incantation. The golden mist swirled around Jake again, lifting him out of her hand and pulling him upward. When he opened his eyes, he was back in Aunt Eleanor's bedroom, sprawled on the floor in front of the wardrobe. The carvings on its doors seemed to glare at him, the tiny figures more alive than ever. "Jake." Aunt Eleanor's sharp voice snapped him out of his daze. She stood in the doorway, her face a mask of fury. "What have you done?" Without thinking, Jake grabbed the nearest heavy object, a brass candlestick, and swung it at the wardrobe. The wood splintered, and a high-pitched wail filled the room. Aunt Eleanor screamed, but Jake didn't stop. He struck the wardrobe again and again until it cracked open, releasing a blinding light. When the light faded, the wardrobe was gone. In its place stood dozens of bewildered people, blinking as if waking from a long sleep. Jake turned to Aunt Eleanor, who now looked smaller, frail, and utterly defeated. "You've ruined everything," she hissed, before collapsing into a heap. Jake didn't wait to find out what happened next. He ran from the room, from the mansion, and didn't stop until he was far away. The summer ended, and Jake never went back to Aunt Eleanor's house. But sometimes, in the quiet of the night, he would hear echoes of the giantess's voice, reminding him of the promise he'd kept and the lives he'd saved. And though he never saw Aunt Eleanor again, he couldn't shake the feeling that her story wasn't quite over. Months had passed since Jake destroyed the enchanted wardrobe and escaped Aunt Eleanor's mansion. Life had returned to normal, or so it seemed. Yet, strange things began happening around him. At first, they were small, almost dismissible, the occasional flicker of golden mist in his peripheral vision or the faint sound of distant footsteps, heavy and echoing. But soon, the peculiarities grew more pronounced. Shadows stretched longer than they should. Carvings of tiny figures appeared on objects in his house, a chair leg, a picture frame, even the handle of his school locker. One night, as Jake was lying in bed, a soft, rumbling voice whispered his name. "Jake. Jake." He shot up, heart pounding, to see a faint glow coming from his closet. Against his better judgment, he crept over and opened the door. Inside was nothing but his clothes and shoes. But as he reached to close it, his hand brushed something cold and metallic. It was a small, brass key, warm to the touch despite its icy appearance. Attached to it was a note written in elegant, swirling handwriting. Asterisk, "The wardrobe is not truly gone. You have unfinished business." Asterisk. Jake's stomach dropped. The giantess had promised that destroying the wardrobe would free the trapped souls and end the curse, but this note suggested otherwise. The next day, Jake couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. At school, he noticed a new girl sitting in the back of his class. She was tall and striking, with golden hair that shimmered as if lit from within. Her piercing blue eyes seemed to bore into Jake whenever he glanced her way. At lunch, she approached him. "You've been marked," she said without preamble, her voice low but commanding. "The curse is not broken. Eleanor isn't finished with you." Jake blinked, confused. Who are you?" The girl smirked. "You may call me Lyra. Let's just say I'm an ally. For now." Lyra explained that destroying the wardrobe had only shattered its physical form. The curse, however, was ancient and far more resilient. Without a vessel to contain it, the magic had begun leaking into Jake's world, corrupting objects and people around him. "Aunt Eleanor?" Jake asked, dreading the answer. "She's weaker now, but not powerless. She'll come for you, and for anyone you care about." Jake's blood ran cold. His parents, his friends, no one would be safe. "What do I do?" he asked, his voice trembling. "You need to find the remnants of the wardrobe," Lyra said. "The carvings, the wood, the brass fittings, they're scattered, but they're still connected. Gather them all, and we might have a chance to seal the curse for good." "But how do I find them?" Jake asked. Lyra handed him the brass key. "This will lead you. But be warned, the pieces are guarded. The more you collect, the more dangerous it will become." Jake had no choice. Over the next few weeks, with Lyra's help, he began tracking down the fragments of the wardrobe. The key glowed faintly whenever they were near, leading him to unlikely places, a dusty antique shop, the basement of his school, even the trunk of a stranger's car. Each fragment pulsed with dark energy, and retrieving them wasn't easy. One piece, a shard of wood embedded in an old rocking chair, caused the chair to spring to life, its legs kicking and thrashing as Jake wrestled it free. Another piece, hidden inside a music box, unleashed an ear-piercing wail that left Jake disoriented and vulnerable to shadowy creatures lurking in the corners of the room. Through it all, Lyra proved an invaluable ally. She seemed to know more about the curse than she let on, but Jake didn't press her for answers. He was too focused on the task at hand. When Jake finally collected the last piece, a small brass handle hidden in a forgotten corner of Aunt Eleanor's garden, Lyra led him to an ancient stone circle deep in the woods. "This is where it ends," she said, her blue eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. "Place the fragments here, and I'll perform the binding spell." As Jake laid the pieces in the center of the circle, the air grew thick with tension. Lyra began chanting in a language Jake didn't recognize, her voice resonating with power. The fragments glowed, then rose into the air, spinning faster and faster. But just as the ritual neared completion, the ground trembled. A cold, sinister laugh echoed through the forest. "Well, isn't this touching?" came a familiar voice. Aunt Eleanor stepped into the clearing, her once frail appearance replaced by a dark, radiant energy. Her eyes glinted with malice as she raised a hand, and the fragments froze midair. "You really thought you could outsmart me," she sneered. "The curse is mine. The power is mine. And now, so are you." Before Jake could react, Eleanor unleashed a wave of energy that sent him and Lyra flying. The fragments began to fuse, forming a new wardrobe, darker and more menacing than before. Jake struggled to his feet, the brass key clutched in his hand. He looked at Lyra, who was badly injured but still conscious. "This is your fight now," she said weakly. "You're the only one who can end this." Summoning every ounce of courage, Jake charged at the wardrobe, the key glowing brighter with each step. Eleanor laughed, but her expression turned to one of shock as Jake plunged the key into the wardrobe's center. The wardrobe let out an unearthly scream as cracks spread across its surface. A blinding light erupted, consuming everything. When the light faded, Jake found himself lying in the grass, the stone circle now empty. Lyra was gone, and so was Aunt Eleanor. In his hand was the brass key, now dull and lifeless. Jake knew the curse was finally over, but the experience had changed him forever. He returned home, vowing to keep his curiosity in check. But deep down, he couldn't help but wonder, had he truly ended the curse? Or had he simply delayed its return?